Dan, hello everyone. Today we have our third session on the subject of organization from a psychic perspective. To start this session, I would like to mention something that appeared to me during the last interview we did 2 days ago. The person we asked, "Are you in contact with your psychic being?" replied, "For me, it's Mother." And from the moment I connect with the Mother, I am in contact with my psychic being. I would like to start this discussion by offering the possibility to continue to think about a possible organization in Auroville, from the perspective of a psychic being, or a psychic field, and to offer this discussion to the Mother, to Auroville, and to the whole world.
Bagwandas, this question is obviously at the center of a new stage in Auroville for me. It is the one that has been missing for all these years. I think that what came to me, because it is something that continues to work after our meetings, is to go back to the beginning of Auroville, where the Mother was in her body, in her physical presence. And the problems of the collective being very present, there was a turn that took place about 1.5 years after the beginning of the Aspiration Collective, when it was chaos at the human level. And in despair of cause, or in new hope, one can say, we wrote to the Mother saying, "Listen, we need to see you. We have problems that we cannot solve and we would like to talk about them." And immediately the Mother answered by saying, "Come." From there, it lasted 6 months. Every week, there was this will from the collective to pose problems at a higher level than a real aspiration. And the Mother's answers, that I recorded at the time, when we came back to the aspiration in the collective, everyone would meet, we would meditate together on the Mother's answers, on this interview that had taken place. And for me, this passage was really the possibility of going beyond our difficulties, to find a new breath, a new aspiration, which went directly to the essential, that is, to this need to refer to another level of knowledge, of answers, which is precisely psychic. So, this week, I thought it was time to come back to this possibility of posing our collective problems, through an organization where there would be groups, where people would be interested, and could take care of it, and try to meet in silence around these questions, by calling on the Mother. I must say that yesterday, a video was posted by Muriel on Mother's interviews. And the interview was about how to face our difficulties, how to solve them. And I must say, that it resonated so much in me, that the essence of the Mother's answer was to you, Lord, to you. That is, at the highest of our possibilities, we address our inner divinity, the Mother, and the answers say, but everything becomes simple at that moment. And I think that this is the most essential answer, the closest to us, as Aurovillians, to perhaps go into another process, that would create this vacuum of aspiration for answers, at another level. And perhaps, even directly in the matter. So I strongly reason with what Claude says, but perhaps not in a formal way, but let's say, bringing the presence of the Mother back into the collective. To be a little more concrete, because this is more an inspiration, that I try to express, perhaps we could link this to groups that would have more responsibility to work at this level, and to be a little bit like the groups that aspire to receive answers. So, does it come by answers in the matter? Does it come as the Mother says? Once we have done this work in this movement, the answers come through different means. To create a collective group process with people who would be willing to do this, and who could become a bit like what we are doing now, and with a group that would have a bit of responsibility, I would not call it the group of wise men, but let's say people who have a certain capacity for unification, for synthesis, and who could take up all these elements on such concrete issues. It's not just about aspirations, because our work at that time with Mother was about really concrete issues. The challenge would be to take up these concrete issues, and put them at another level of aspiration, to have answers coming from another level. And then, it's a collective organization that would be at the center of something, that would later be a working group, and would leave from there, as a collective center of aspiration, which would give the right note to the answers.
Kripa, I have a question. For some people, there is a form of evidence in the relationship to the Mother. Either because we met her, or because we have a strong affinity for her and a recognition of the Mother, but not everyone has it. Some people have a strong relationship with Sri Aurobindo and have trouble with the Mother. So, it seems natural to us to talk about the mother and refer to her, but I'm not sure that everyone thinks the same way. And, as we have already discussed in previous sessions, there are people who came to Auroville not knowing, consciously or in front of them, why they came here, why they were brought here, why they were guided here. And then, as they live here, they create a bond, they create a relationship, and it makes sense. Some people will say, 30 or 40 years later, I realize why I came to Auroville, or why I did yoga all these years, or what the connection is. And so, the question I ask myself is, how can we unite? How can we ignite this same devotion, this gift of self that we can feel when we meet the mother? And how has it completely transformed their lives? And the energy in which they work, in which they breathe, in which they are, and so it's easy to say, we reconnect to that, to move forward together, each of us. But I don't know how to make this atmosphere palpable enough so that everyone can connect.
Alan. References to the mother or references to Sri Aurobindo, maybe that's not really the problem. The question is about an attitude, that people can accept or not, to have this attitude of reference to something, to a higher consciousness. What Auroville needs is, how we connect to this higher consciousness, whose the mother tells us, is the most effective in all aspects. She tells us, it's the one that can solve the most material problems, in the most effective way. Sometimes, people think that higher thoughts are good for. No. She says, it's the most effective in all cases. So the question is, and that's why I want to talk about atmosphere, we can talk about attitude, how do we create, and this is not obvious, how do we create in Auroville this kind of collective acceptance, that we need to try to find together an access, or an influence, or the capacity to receive an influence, that will guide us in the face of problems? In the face of choices? In the face of collective decisions? I think that's the question. We had meetings, where people were speaking, and at some point, in relation to a question we asked ourselves collectively, someone said something, and at that moment, there was no need to vote, no need to. Yes, 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 that's it, that's it. And that's a small or a big state of grace. And we feel that everyone is. There's a moment, when we feel that people are happy, they feel that. It's as if we've achieved something. And those moments of grace, for me, are the accumulation of those moments of grace, especially, if they can be experienced collectively, which can be Auroville's method. Which is not a method, if I may say so, but it's a way of approaching things. It's a question of a lot of ways. And I think that in Auroville, we suffered at some point, because a political aspect came in, an ideology. And the ideology is formidable. The ideology of the builders of the city is dreadful, and the ideology of those who resisted it, whether they were right or wrong. Because in fact, neither of them were wrong or right. It's just different ways of approaching the problem, but they hardened with a kind of mental tightness, that suddenly, no longer listens and is not really interested in the dialogue with others. And I remember, there was an extraordinary example for me. It was when an architect, whom I will not name, made an effort to study the possibilities of the practical application of the galaxy, while taking into account the problems of the land. And this report, which was a fairly detailed and thorough report, which required a lot of work, was given to the group that was in charge of the development of Auroville. And a while later, when this person asked, well, what about my report? Oh, yes, but the group. There are people in the group, who didn't even want to look at it. And that's really the quintessence of what Auroville should not be. And so, it shows how, at some point, unfortunately, we went into this thing which was quite destructive. So how can we create a completely different atmosphere? That's what's important to me.
Claude. Maybe just in reference to this link to the mother and Sri Aurobindo, I like this sentence of the mother, which says, call it what you want, call it divine. I like this perfection that we want to become. I think everyone can hear this at all levels. Everyone can apply it in their relationship to others, in their work, in this perfection that we want to become.
Elisa, I think we're really talking about the first attitude at the heart of each individual and collective. And I think we all agree that I think we all signed, mentally, energetically, we all signed to be the instruments of divine consciousness, by being Aurovillians. Newcomers, Aurovillians. For me, there's a membrane that we went through where we agreed on this. And I think, if we put this at the heart, as well as the charter, as well as other essential documents, that were given to us by Mother and Sri Aurobindo, not documents, but a spirit, a deep guidance, that gives the heart, that gives this note. For me, the note is there, the guidance is there, and then to start, by saying that we don't know anything about it, we don't know what it means as humans and how it translates. And for me, I would take things step by step, and agree that we are instruments and we know nothing as humans for now. And what does that mean? For me, it means shifting the meetings. If we realize, it's above all, at least going through a phase, where silence becomes the basis, rather than speaking, and speaking is the basis. Speaking is a form of knowledge, a form of bringing something. And I think shifting our dynamics, which seem basic, but which are very, very deep in my opinion, and meeting on an ocean of silence. With this attitude of, we don't know, we are these human beings, and we see the bubbles, that will come, and will come to express themselves on essential issues, such as collective organization, I think that would be a very healthy basis to say to ourselves, what if we started from scratch? As I said last time, what if we stopped everything somewhere? Obviously, it doesn't mean we stop everything if there are needs, we can have continuous groups, that's not the question. But if we agree to start from a blank page, what would it look like? With things at heart, such as, we are instruments individually and collectively, we don't know, and the world becomes so intense that we don't know, we have things to discover. And there is also a potential to sit down all together. There is a potential to sit down individually, each in their own home, but sitting down all together in this posture is extremely powerful. Just as a basis. We have no. For the organizer, we have no trait, but I find it extremely powerful. And then to see, once again, with phases of reflection, phases of contemplation, phases of meditation, phases of creativity, where all together we create this movement, where we see what would enchant us to co-create. I don't have the ingredients for that, but for me this basis would be a very healthy one. And the fact of going back to experimentation. Because the governance that followed in Auroville, for me there are forms, where we went into fixations and patterns, that were fixed, while we knew they had their limitations, and we didn't allow ourselves to see them again. And that for me, is something where in Auroville, no. Why do we keep something in the same way? We have our toxic individual patterns. Why do I keep them? So how can we pose this kind of new dynamics? And for me, once again, it's not a question of groups. Honestly, I'm afraid of groups. At the level of consciousness we are in, there are always these offshoots, of the head from the body, always, I've always seen that. And for me, the heart of governance is what dynamics, what are the dynamics? And that will bind our individual governance and our collective governance.
Kripa, it comes back to me. We quote a lot of Kirat at the moment, but it comes back to me, at that moment, in what you say, Alisa, when he had proposed that we re-sign and remake a pledge. Kirat had proposed that we re-sign, all collectively, individually, that we remake a pledge in relation to the ideas of Auroville, that we do a bit of tabula rasa and say, okay, where am I? And I re-engage myself, and I see my relationship inside. And he saw that, and I remember, he had asked Christine to make a sort of notebook or book, to print something, and it had been discussed for a while, to see where this book could be placed, and how we could have all the Aurovillians, voluntarily, at some point, come and sign and re-engage. And then from there, you see again. It must have been maximum in the year 2000s, around 2000, somewhere between 1999 and 2000.
Paquandas. I think we are, indeed, at the heart of what we are being asked, the conscience, the collective heart, perhaps, asking the Aurovillians to re-engage in an engagement that is at another level, and that is defined by this first part of the Charter of Auroville, which is, to be a servant of the divine conscience. I wanted to make a small parenthesis. When Mother said, if it bothers you, the divine, we put the perfect conscience. Claude, you said, indeed, this perfection, that we are somewhere. Obviously, it was an engagement that every Aurovillian who comes to Auroville to engage in this adventure. Well, it is necessary to remember that we are here for something special. We cannot extract, I think, a kind of false modesty at the collective level that confuses when we say, Mother or Sri Aurobindo, we are talking about a higher conscience. We must also be able to demystify Mother and Sri Aurobindo, in the sense that we can very quickly fall back into the religious side. This is quite dangerous, we must be very careful about this. But at the same time, we can know what we are talking about when we talk about a perfect consciousness. It is a movement that each person who comes here leaves a lot behind for something superior. This is where we have in common. And it is on this something that we could name a work. That would take the form to define, but that would go through something very clear. It is the beginning, the first part of the Auroville Charter. It is the individual commitment for a collective experience. That is at another level of commitment. And I like the idea that you said, Kripa, to recall what Kirat asked you, because we can see that, little by little, this collective aspiration has crumbled the floors towards something much more pragmatic, practical, and thus, losing the flame, the aspiration. I think that this phase of Auroville, this new stage of Auroville, should go back to this level. I think a lot about what she said about the things we have experienced, the experiences that we have experienced, and that gave us this faith that remains, despite all the difficulties, and that must be cultivated in a methodical way. We must apply our instruments to this aspiration. We have a mental. But she said, the first thing is to have clarity in the mind. When you formulate a question, it must be very clear if you want an answer. So it's up to us to find the right questions, to formulate these right questions, to have answers at higher levels of consciousness. So, there is a group work to do, which is also very pragmatic, very accessible at the moment. What are the questions, for which we would like answers to, for the new stage of Auroville?
Elisa, I don't have mental clarity, but there is something quite joyful and exciting about the idea. If we agree that each one renews their own commitment, and is in a moment of mirroring with oneself before signing. But this moment of resumption of our commitment, and how it translates into the collective. I was talking about spaces of silence, where we acknowledge that we are in this beginner's mind, and that there are many things we don't know. We won't spend years. Well, why not? We can have spaces dedicated to silence, but we can also have brainstorming, because it's still super fun to exchange, to share. I love intellectual challenges too, so for me the mind is a tool that is really that has its light and its power. There is creativity, imagination, which you mentioned last time too, that we have spaces, like this, where we feed these new muscles, this new intuition. And for me, where we practice. Again, to come back to the idea of why we stay in fixed patterns, when we could have spaces, somewhere, collective agreements, where we do trainings, but we have fun. We do trainings, we learn to be in intuition, we learn to be in silence, to develop, to be in hyper-creative spaces, where you can write on all the walls, you can express ideas, in many forms, in many colors, through many mediums. I think that, again, we come back to the inner attitude, how to detach from. We must be perfect, we are not in a religious system, and even the silence, I was proposing, can have a tendency to take itself very seriously. It becomes very rigid, very gloomy, and suddenly it scares me a bit. So it's about how to come back to experimentation, where we train together, we taste together. And, at the same time, last time I was proposing. I don't know why I'm visualizing this, but I really have this idea, that we can. Because when I was in the groups, there was something for me. I don't know if you were in the groups, but there was something for me that seemed so, not okay, which was. We are a group of 7 or 8, and there are a few people in Auroville, who are aware of what is happening in our collective body. And I agree that there is sensitive data, but there is something where. Well, it was not okay. Because, when we are not informed of what is happening, we are less responsible. And there was this lack of knowledge, this lack of sharing of responsibility, this lack of sharing of transparency. And so I come back to the idea that we could have, so that we are more aware and informed of our collective body, like these maps that I saw online, like layers. I don't know if you see layers. And there could be a map of wealth circulation, and not just money, wealth in many forms, exchanges, time, talent, but also money. When once there was the conflict layer, the inflammation of the collective body, and with appeals for support and resources in such and such places, I think that, once again, these ad hoc groups are created and practice these new muscles together. These new muscles of, I don't care about the idea. What I find very interesting, is to be in movement, and in a kind of intellectual, spiritual, energetic, emotional gymnastics together. I find that super fun. Really super fun.
Paquantis, perhaps, in fact, the forms are currently difficult to define because, according to what we can feel from our sharing, what is important is to create dynamics. It's to do it again, like in Tao, where there are these two dynamic forces, with the center in the middle, but we feel that we have lost our center, because the dynamics of the two movements, or of this yin and yang movement, which corresponds to this philosophy of Tao, that can be seen in life as a whole. It's the same. As soon as this dynamic stops, or at least slows down, naturally, the center loses its interest, its strength of cohesion. I believe that the dynamic that is created by the center, the psychic being, our inner divinity, is precisely the center. It's around this that we have to recreate this dynamic. Let's call it as we want, let's define things, but we have to reach a common denominator that goes beyond the forms, that is, the search for unity, the search for the center and for unity. This dynamic, maybe we can define several forms, but is it possible now? I don't know. Maybe they will come as the sharing movement that you started with these different groups, will take its strength, create a dynamic, and through that, there will be something that will be more and more defined. I have the impression. Maybe there are things that will emerge very quickly, but the process of starting, the dynamic, is the most important thing at the moment.
Alan, yes, in these questions of collective organization, we have a certain experience and a lot of failures. I remember, for example, the history of the circles. At the beginning of the 2000s, there was a movement that was generous, saying that we had to organize sharing more, on a material level. So, a lot of circles were created. There were 7 or 8 or 9. They were groups of 15 or 20 people, and to a certain extent, they shared resources. I'm talking about this because for me it was quite fascinating to see how an intention, that was completely legitimate and valid, and I would even say sincere, could eventually be broken down quite quickly. Because there may not have been a big enough account of what human nature is, of what interpersonal difficulties are. And most of these groups eventually fell apart, because the rules of the game were perhaps not really well defined. Each group had to define them in a way, and I know that a lot of people got tired, especially because, in cases like this, there are the contributors, and those who are. There are the net contributors, and there are those who. Yes, it was at the economic level. Excuse me, yes, they were economic sharing groups. So, there were people who could contribute, and there were people who, above all, needed to be completed. And I think the shock was, that in many of these groups, there was a behavior of some people that eventually tired the people who contributed, and in fact most of these groups stopped quite quickly. And, yet it was a huge effort, that had been made at the time. By the way, curiously, the only group that still exists, which is called SIDE, is a sharing group that eventually continued to function, because each person was specifically responsible. That is, the group shared resources, but these resources meant that people could at times use these resources, but they were still supposed to try to find a way to return or give back, or to explain why. And it's quite ironic that the one, who is apparently the least idealistic of all the groups, is the one who still continues to this day. It's quite funny. So, for me, there is a kind of lesson in this. And I think that there is an aspect of Mother that we sometimes forget, and that is, that she was also extremely realistic. Mother was someone who had. She was extremely concrete in her way of doing things. It's interesting, because I see these important movements, these moments, where Auroville wants to try to re-grasp a collective dynamic, and try to build it in the best way possible. We don't know exactly what it is. And at the same time, I think it's very important to keep a certain sense of what is really possible, at a given moment.
Kripa, during our long silence, I wasn't at all silent in my head, and I was going over a lot of experiences of collective reorganization that we had. And I was thinking about Karit, and why we talk so much about Karit during these few sessions that we have together. It's because Karit was a great engine in the reorganization of the collective. And the work that was done with him was enormous, whether it was at the level of the circles with the economy, whether it was. I remember meetings, one after the other, with all the units, and we had big discussions about the contribution, about the reason for being of these units, about how they saw their contribution to Auroville, whether it was at the level of the work, at the level of the collective. Why were there units that remained only on a financial margin to self-finance? And what would make these units a school to finance the community much more actively and massively? There were discussions about education, about the entry process of Auroville. There were all these sectors that were reviewed. There was a huge mobilization of the community to put in place new things. I also remembered this famous retreat. I don't remember the name of the person who initiated it, but it was someone who proposed it. There is a lot of goodwill in Auroville, and I am always amazed by it. Honestly, because even for this retreat, there were groups, growth, there were many themes, and for months and months, people worked together with the goal of meeting together for 3 days to share the results of our reflections. And it was really taken seriously. There was a kind of dynamism and a wind in the community that was very, very positive. In the context of the retreat itself, the 3 days were not so fantastic in terms of the input of what was done. And even in terms of what was launched during this period with Karit, I don't really know what is left. So, it's a real challenge, the collective. How do we stay in things that are comfortable? And I remember in the circles, young, enthusiastic, and idealistic people that I was, much more than now, when Karit brought me to the circles, he insisted a lot on having a volunteer base. And I told him, but if you want to change the economy of Auroville, everyone has to participate. Absolutely everyone has to be there. So you have to go there, there is no choice. If you want to do this, there is no choice. Everyone has to sign. And he said, no, not at all. Because if there is no inner movement that accompanies a new experience, it will not work. So, what do we do in a human laboratory with people who are all there by their own free will? Because when you join Auroville, it's a personal choice and it's a step that you take individually. But everyone has their own level of consciousness and everyone is there to do what they have to do. And can we push the machine faster than what is happening? Another question and no answer, but I don't know.
Dan, I like questions without answers, because for me the question has a benefit by itself. Because it puts things in motion. I really like what Alan said earlier, that is to say, that grace is available, and it is able to sweep away absolutely all constraints and material problems. And it's as if there was a form of hiatus. That means that collectively, we are not able to reproduce what is happening individually. I explain myself, I have a great faith individually. And I think it's probably because of everything that has happened in recent years, that at some point I accepted a form of surrender. And it was at that moment that there was a form of shift that really taught me to distinguish what is happening on the human side and what is happening on the non-human side. And I really like what Elisa says too, in the sense that we are in a place of experimentation, and there is no reason to reproduce things that are done elsewhere. It's as if we had absolutely everything. We are here with the condition that to be here, you have to be a willing servitor of divine consciousness. And yet, we continue to meet and discuss and argue and fight and vote. So there is a form of collective hypnosis that makes that at certain moments, individually, at least that's what happens to me. I grasp something, and I know that everything is there. So, I think we all certainly have this vision that everything is there, and that we are very close to achieving it, but we can't do it collectively. So, to promote personal initiatives, I was having lunch with friends and they were saying to me, why don't we do it as if? Why don't we create a wise camp that does it as if? That is, to find a way to have a problem, and to solve it by silence. I don't know if this kind of technique has ever been experimented, but we come back to the power of play, the power of doing as if. The wise camp is not necessarily looking for the wisest among us, it is looking for people who, at a certain moment, are able to connect internally with each other, on a realm and to grasp this grace, that will emerge to solve the current problem. I think we are perhaps in the best position today in Auroville to start this kind of experimentation.
Elisa, when I hear you describe it, it's true that when I see all the momentum, the initiatives, I see little ones that have been around me, and I see much bigger ones in the community. And finally, there is this beauty in believing, in being together, in putting our energies together. And, at the same time, there is this ploof, and behind that, there is a form of exhaustion. And, it can sometimes affect. I have often heard people say, people who no longer believe in it, who even disconnect from the subject of governance, and who come back to a belief in individual governance, and that our collective governance will only come from there. So, if we were all together as a community, I would like to ask questions like. And I think that one of the pillars of what we say is that of the power of questions, rather than bringing answers, is what are the really interesting questions for us, with which we can move forward, and for me, to go and pick up the fruits of our history, what has been a bit of a drag on us, what has been a bit of a burden on us, what has been a burden, all these years, and what has been uplifting, what were the moments and the clicks, or the ingredients that made it all. There were uplifting dynamics, and that we can be, in my opinion, a laboratory that doesn't do experiments for nothing. I fully trust that at an energetic and more subtle level, we record things, and that the experiences are experienced in us, and at the level of consciousness, they bring us something, and we move forward with the fruits of this experience. Nevertheless, we are a laboratory. Why don't we document our experiences in one form or another, and keep a thread of gold, and build on that with key points? What has brought us more confidence, more faith in this collective? What has uplifted us? What has amused us? What has created this link, in different facets? I think there are key questions we could ask ourselves, to look at the past, to ask ourselves in the present, and to see what are the first steps we could take together, on these blank pages.
Dan, the greatest discoveries, the Eurekas, were made without searching. The discovery was not the object of the research.
Alan, thinking back to the years with Kirit, I remember that, when I learned that Kirit was named chairman, it gave me a considerable emotion. I remember, I was in tears, and I thought, that's it, Auroville is back on track, it's fantastic. And in the end, when we did the assessment, it wasn't as fantastic as that. It was both very good, and at the same time, a little disappointing, compared to what we could expect. What was very apparent to me, was that there were difficulties and traps. I think one of the traps in which Kirit was more or less forced to give up, was the matrimandir issue. There was a huge matrimandir crisis. It was at the time, when the group was eliminated, and it was a very, very hard crisis. I remember, Serge and I went to see the people of the same group at the time, and what struck us was, that these people seemed to have an attitude like, oh, very good, you agree with that, that's perfect. Now what's more? Instead of saying, okay, we can. It was the impression, that they always had to have more. And it collapsed, of course. But, it created a huge crisis for Kirit, which even affected his health, because he almost died at that time. And maybe sometimes, we don't realize, how much Auroville is a place where huge forces are fighting. Forces that are opposing each other, because in the end, they know. And when the Asura said to Mother, I know I'll be destroyed, but in the meantime, I'll break everything. That's what Satprem said one day. He said to Luke, do the little people of Auroville realize the gigantic clash of forces, that are fighting over Auroville? So, I don't think we should create an artificial fear of these things, but I think it's important to be aware, that the resistances we all manifest in our own way, are also sharpened by forces, that want to block, at all costs, what is a fundamental threat to these forces. Because Auroville. Sometimes we wonder, the divine strategies are surprising. Because what is this tiny, tiny thing called Auroville, that could potentially be the place, where the superhuman would be? The disproportion between the appearance of the importance of Auroville and the stakes, not only of the world, is absolutely overwhelming. So we are in this extraordinary mystery of the divine's methods. If we have them, we don't know. We try to see what we can do to grasp them. I think we have to be aware of that.
Paquantis, I feel that we are turning around the heart of the question. And it gives a real inner joy, because that's where the Auroville challenge is. There's one thing I feel too, that at the beginning of Auroville, it wasn't at the level it is today. The pioneering side of Auroville is quite remarkable in the context in which the world was in 1968. And, at the moment, what surprises and makes me happy is to see how the world moves, and on the chaotic side, but also on the level of awareness that is operated in many groups. Many groups that speak of the divine, that meet around this really spiritual research in the broad sense of the term. And, I think that Auroville, the dimension of Auroville with the world, is also fundamental, I think, because Mother was very clear on that. She said that Auroville was for the earth, for humanity. And somehow, this opening of Auroville at the level of the world is also part of the next step. How does Auroville connect in a much more conscious way, and voluntary to all these movements that are emerging all over the world, where the divine is the heart of the question? And I think that, in fact, maybe, let's hope, but we have reasons to hope, that Auroville has contributed to allow this evolution. I remember, I left in 1968, I stayed 17 years without returning to France, I came back in 2000, after 17 years, and I was astonished to have totally different relations with people, and to see research that was operating around partnering with the divine, whereas in 1968, we didn't even talk about consciousness. And, let's not talk about the divine, at least not the religious God. So, this is great. It proves that there is a great evolution that has been operating in the world, and I think that Auroville has the duty to find openings, to create openings, and synergies with the world, and all these groups that also work in this direction. Paquandas, I feel that we are turning around the heart of the question. And it gives a real inner joy, because that's where the Auroville challenge is. There's one thing I feel too, that at the beginning of Auroville, it wasn't at the level it is today. The pioneering side of Auroville is quite remarkable in the context in which the world was in 1968. And, at the moment, what surprises and makes me happy is to see how the world moves, and on the chaotic side, but also on the level of awareness that is operated in many groups. Many groups that speak of the divine, that meet around this really spiritual research in the broad sense of the term. And, I think that Auroville, the dimension of Auroville with the world, is also fundamental, I think, because Mother was very clear on that. She said that Auroville was for the earth, for humanity. And somehow, this opening of Auroville at the level of the world is also part of the next step. How does Auroville connect in a much more conscious way, and voluntary to all these movements that are emerging all over the world, where the divine is the heart of the question? And I think that, in fact, maybe, let's hope, but we have reasons to hope, that Auroville has contributed to allow this evolution. I remember, I left in 1968, I stayed 17 years without returning to France. I came back in 2000, after 17 years, and I was astonished to have totally different relations with people, and to see research that was operating around partnering with the divine, whereas in 1968, we didn't even talk about consciousness. And, let's not talk about the divine, at least not the religious God. So, this is great. It proves that there is a great evolution that has been operating in the world, and I think that Auroville has the duty to find openings, to create openings, and synergies with the world, and all these groups that also work in this direction.
Dan, thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this testimonial. If you would like to take part in this project on the inner being, or if you have any questions or comments for our team or participants, please feel free to contact us using the email at the bottom of this webpage.
This is Auroville Radio, voices from the city of Dawn.
Thank you for listening to this testimonial. If you would like to take part in this project on the inner being, or if you have any questions or comments for our team or participants, please feel free to contact us using the email at the bottom of this webpage.
This is Auroville Radio, Voices from the City of Dawn.